Good afternoon, revered professors and my dear batchmates. Today, our group is going to speak on the topic prokaryotic gene regulation. First of all, we need to know what is actually gene regulation. Gene regulation refers to the complex biochemical mechanisms that control the timing, location, and the amount of functional gene products. In prokaryotes, gene regulation mainly occurs through transcriptional control, which involves regulatory proteins and
Hey.
other factors which accelerate or
Doctor
depress
Majaga Naik.
transcription.
Last bench.
Aside from transcriptional control, other mechanisms also exist. They include gene amplification and rearrangement. This falls under the transcriptional control itself. Then after transcription, we have post-transcriptional control, where the RNA transcript that is formed undergoes modification and stabilization. Then comes the translational control, where regulation of initiation of protein synthesis occurs. And lastly, the post-translational control, where the protein that is formed is modified, localized, and degraded as per requirements. Next, we need to know why is gene regulation actually important for prokaryotes. It is important for their development and differentiation. It is important for their adaptation to environmental changes, and it is also important for their energy production and nutrient conservation. And how is this gene regulation important to us with respect to humans? It is to obtain specific gene products, to study hormonal responses, growth factors, and environmental stress, to study diseases, and for the development of targeted therapies and treatment. Next, I will pass on the mic to my batchmate Mazabin.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Mazabin Khatun. My roll number is 62, and I am going to further proceed this presentation. And the topic is, the heading is the pattern of gene expression response. They are of three types: type A, type B, and type C. Type A is signal-dependent expression, in which gene expression increases while the inducer signal is present. It is seen in prokaryotes with nutritional changes and hormonal and growth factors. The graph also depicts here that as when the signal is turned off, the gene expression is also turned off. In type B, it is transient expression, where temporary increase despite continued signals shows desensitization and recovery. It is commonly seen in pharmacological agents, and the graph here depicted, while the signal is present, the gene expression is desensitized here, and in this the recovery phase is important. Type C, irreversible expression. In this, the signal acts as a trigger. Expression persists permanently here. It is commonly seen during tissue and organ differentiation inherited by daughter cells. And the graph here depicted that even the signal ends, but the gene expression continues. And here we are going to talk about cystone. Cystone is a segment of DNA that codes for a single polypeptide or a functional protein, and it is functionally equivalent to a gene in molecular biology. There are two types of cystonic organization, that is monocystonic and polycystonic. Monocystonic contains one coding gene, while the polycystonic mRNA contains multiple coding regions. Monocystonic mRNA produces only one polypeptide, while polycystonic mRNA produces multiple proteins. In monocystonic mRNA, it is typically seen in eukaryotic cell because each protein usually requires independent regulations, while in polycystonic mRNA, it is commonly seen in prokaryotes, where functionally related genes are arranged in operons. Monocystonic mRNA is commonly seen in human insulin gene, while polycystonic mRNA is commonly seen in lac operon in bacteria. In the diagram here, it is depicted that monocystonic mRNA produces a single protein, while the polycystonic mRNA produces several proteins. Operon. An operon is a functional unit of DNA mainly in prokaryotes, which is a group of structurally related genes regulated by a regulatory element, and it is transcribed as single polycystonic mRNA. Importance: it allows coordinated regulation of regulated gene and helps in conservation of energy and resources. The components of operons are promoter, operator, and structural genes, which are regulated by regulatory gene, and the polycystonic mRNA, which is transcribed, are translated into several proteins. And there are two types of operon, that are inducible operon and repressible operon. Inducible operons are the operons that are normally switched off and it is turned on in the presence of inducer which activates the transcription of gene. For example, lac operon inducer lactose, especially allolactose function, controls gene required for lactose metabolism. While in repressible operon, is an operon which is generally switched off, which is generally switched on, and it is turned off when a core pressure is present preventing the transcription of gene. For example, TRP operon, core pressure is tryptophan function, controls gene required for tryptophan synthesis. Now I am going to pass this to my fellow batchmate Moinak.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Moinak. I'm going to, my roll number is 63. I'm going to present here on the topic lac operon. We need to know what is actually lac operon. Lac operon is a cluster of genes. It is involved in the uptake and metabolism of lactose. Its expression is regulated as a single unit, and it is a classical example of inducible gene regulation and a type A regulation. It is found in Escherichia coli. In 1961, Francois Jacob and Jacques Monod put forward their concept of operon, and their hypothesis was based on the metabolism of lactose in intestinal bacteria E. coli itself, and for this they were awarded a Nobel Prize in 1965. Now, to understand the mechanism of lac operon, we need to first know what are the components of lac operon. And before saying that, this specific diagram you all would know, we have all studied this during NEET in class 12 NCERT. But because it gives a very basic idea of what actually happens in a lac operon. But today we will be discussing the lac operon based on this specific illustration of lac operon. So I'm going to discuss the components present here. First, we have the regulatory gene, which is the LAC-I gene. It produces a repressor protein or LAC-I repressor. LAC-I repressor, actually the LAC-I gene is a constitutive gene, which means it undergoes expression at a constant rate, producing 4 subunits of repressor. These 4 subunits of repressor actually together they assemble together and bind to the operator region. Next we have the promoter region where the RNA polymerase binds. Third we have the operator region. It is the site where the repressor binds. And next we have the 3 structural genes, the LAC-Z gene which codes for beta galactosidase enzyme which cleaves the lactose into galactose and glucose. The LAC-Y gene which codes for permease enzyme which is responsible for uptake of galactosides like lactose inside the bacterial cell. And thirdly we have the LAC-A gene which codes for transacetylase or thiogalactoside transacetylase, whose present function is not known, but it is somewhat responsible for detoxification. Okay, so the function of lac operon is, we can explain it on the basis of 3 scenarios. The first scenario where the lac operon is present in a medium where inducer or lactose is absent but glucose is present in huge amount. Now I need to say this, that when in a medium when both glucose and lactose are present, the bacterial cells first utilize the glucose for energy production purposes, and only when the glucose is depleted completely it turns on the lactose operating machinery. So in this situation, the bacterial cell is utilizing glucose for its energy requirement, but as lactose is absent in the medium, so as I already said that LAC-I gene is a constitutive gene, it forms a repressor tetramer. The repressor tetramer, because lactose is absent, directly binds to the operator region, for which the RNA polymerase is not able to bind to the promoter region, and as a result there is no transcription of the LAC-Z, LAC-Y or LAC-A gene. In this case, we can see the lac operon is in a turned off state. In the second scenario, in the medium, both inducer, that is lactose or its analog like allolactose is present along with glucose is present. Now, as I discussed earlier that the repressor tetramer has 4 subunits. 2 of the subunits bind to the operator region, but 2 of the subunits remain free in the cytosol. What happens is that these 2 free subunits have very high affinity for the inducer, this lactose. What happens is that they bind with the repressor CAP-CAMP complex. CAP means CAMP activator protein along with the CAMP, which is cyclic adenosine monophosphate. It binds in this CRE region. This CRE region is known as the CAP response element. It comes here and it directly contacts with the alpha subunit of the RNA polymerase, and a positive protein-protein interaction occurs normally so that the RNA polymerase can bind to this promoter region and transcribe the whole LAC-Z, LAC-Y and LAC in a coordinate fashion. But in this case, as glucose is present in very high amounts, glucose actually inhibits adenylyl cyclase enzyme. Adenylyl cyclase enzyme actually is responsible for converting ATP to cyclic AMP. Now, as it is inhibited, so cyclic AMP is not present. So cyclic AMP, so CAP-C complex is also not able to bind in this CRE region. As a result, the RNA polymerase binding is not efficient in this region. As a result, there is no efficient transcription in this certain scenario. Thirdly, we have the third case in which lac-operon is present in a medium in which only lactose is present and all the glucose is depleted. Now, in this case, as all the glucose is already used up, so the adenylyl cyclase. So I'll complete the topic here only. I'll give the mic to Masur.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Masur Rahman. Today I am going to discuss about tryptophan operon. Tryptophan operon is a repressible operon found in E. coli. It regulates the biosynthesis of tryptophan. And it is an example of negative gene regulation. It contains 5 structural genes. Each gene codes for an enzyme that are responsible for tryptophan synthesis. These 5 structural genes shares a promoter and an operator, and further upstream of operon we will find a regulatory gene in tryptophan repressor. The regulatory gene encodes for inactive repressor. This inactive repressor cannot bind to operator, therefore cannot limit transcription of structural gene.
Okay, this is a very, very big topic. Just explain in 1 or 2 minutes what is the role of leader mRNA in tryptophan operon.
Today our topic of discussion is regulation of blood pH. Let me first introduce you to the team. My name is MD Abdur. We have MD Rahil, MD Aryan, MD Salul and MD Raju. So first is, these are the topics that we will be covering today. First is the pH. pH is the negative logarithm of H plus ion concentration. Next is the normal range of pH, that is 7.35 to 7.45, and the venous blood is slightly lower than the normal atrial blood. If the pH goes below 7.35, we classify it as acidemia, whereas if it goes above 7.45, we classify it as alkemia. Next up is, our body has 2 types of acids. First is the volatile acid, which is H2CO3. Next is the non-volatile acid, which is phosphoric acid, lactic acid. Our body has 3 lines of defense for regulation of pH. First is the chemical buffers, which act immediately within milliseconds. And next is the respiratory regulation, which acts within minutes to hours. This eliminates the volatile acid. And next is the renal regulation, which acts within days, and this eliminates the non-volatile acid, mainly the phosphoric acid.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is MD Razumia. Now I am going to discuss the buffer. What is buffer? A mixture of a weak acid and its strong conjugate base, or the weak base and its strong conjugate acid. The buffer pH of buffer is formulated by the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, that is pH equal pKa plus log base concentration of base by concentration of acid. The buffering capacity, the capacity that resists the pH changes by resists the pH changes quantified as the moles of strong acid or base required to alter 1 liter of buffer solution by 1 pH unit. Optimal efficiency when reaches its maximum effectiveness when the solution of pH is equal to the pKa value. Next, we will discuss the bicarbonate buffer system, primary buffer. So, components of bicarbonate buffer is carbonic acid H2CO3 weak acid and bicarbonate ions, that is conjugate base. Acidic buffering mechanism, strong acid react with bicarbonate to form the weak carbonic acid, preventing the drastic pH drops. Base buffering mechanism, strong base reacts with carbonic acid H2CO3 to form the neutral water and bicarbonate salt that prevent the drastic pH spikes. The pKa paradox, despite the pKa of 6.1, that is fall outside the optimal pH plus minus 1 range for the blood pH of 7.4. This is the most critical buffer in the extracellular fluid matrix. Efficiency factor on the ratio of 20:1 when the exceptionally high ratio of 20:1 between bicarbonate and dissolved CO to shift its maximal buffering power directly toward the physiological pH of 7.4. Efficiency factor, 2 components are actively regulated by vital organs, that's lungs and kidneys. Lungs regulate the partial pressure of carbon dioxide and kidneys regulate the excrete or regenerate bicarbonate ion. Next I will discuss by Aryan.
Hello everyone, my name is Mohammad Aryan Rahman. Now what I will contain this slide. Phosphate buffer, as we know, H3PO4 is H3PO4. There is 3 H plus that we can freely remove. That's why there are 3 pK values that are successively increasing. their physical increasing. First, H2PO4 converted to H2PO4 and plus H plus. Then second H plus removing, then third H plus, and successive pK values are increasing. Since pK2 values 6.8 is close to physiological pH, and in phosphate buffer, there is physical system there are HPO4 2 minus and HPO4 minus. Despite of the optimal pH buffer closing to the ECF, phosphate buffer does not play predominant role in defending the ECF pH. As because HPO4 minus and HPO4 2 minus that is comparatively low in ECF, that's why that has no low level. That's why they are not does not play prominent role in defending ECF. However, intercellular fluid rich in organic and inorganic phosphate. That's why phosphate buffer is a major buffer system in the cell as well. Similarly, it also acts as a major buffer in renal tubules where phosphate concentration are high, and the pH is much closer to pK2 of H3PO4 than the pH of the ECF. The pK2 values is average of pK1 and pK3 values. That's why the ECF values is physical pH is equal to pK2 value. Now protein and hemoglobin buffer. As we know, after water, protein is most abundant in blood. That's why protein is the most abundant buffer in blood. Histidine dominance, the immunosynthetase group of histidine, that pK 6.0, is a major contributor with 38 residual present in a single hemoglobin molecule. Cysteine and R group, sulfonyl groups of cysteine, which pK is 8.3, and ionizable side chains provide additional buffer capacity. Temporary binding, this buffer acts as a stabilizer pH by soaking up shifts, but the only bind to ion temporarily. For organ excretion, as we know, the protein does not is the elimination of waste, but the respiratory and the renal system must perform the actual removal of excess acids or bases. Now I'll give this mic to Mohammed Salil to continue this.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mohammed Salil Rahman, and roll number is 70. And so let us see how the respiratory regulation of pH takes place. So we know that in the body, the gaseous exchange between the O2 and CO2 occurs at two sites, pulmonary capillaries and capillaries of the peripheral tissues. The CO2, the product of tissue respiration, which diffuses from the cell into the tissue fluid and at the capillary interface diffuses across the capillary membrane into the blood. The CO2 is transported in the pulmonary capillaries by mainly three mechanisms. So let us see one by one how the three mechanisms takes place. So in the first diagram, we can see that the CO2 enters the RBCs where it reacts with the water in the presence of an enzyme carbonic anhydrase to form the carbonic acid H2CO3, and it dissociates to form H plus and HCO3 negative. And this H plus reacts with oxyhemoglobin to release oxygen and forms deoxyhemoglobin. And this effect is known as the Boas effect. So HCO3 formed is transported from RBC into the plasma by this anion exchanger protein in exchange for chlorine from the plasma. And this effect is known as the Hamburger's effect. The transport in the form of bicarbonate accounts for about 70% of the total CO2 transport. And in the second diagram, we can see that the CO2 also directly reacts with the N terminal of the amino groups of the globin chains of the hemoglobin, and rest approximately 10% of the CO2 is transported in the dissolved state. So let us see what happens in the pulmonary capillaries. So in the pulmonary capillaries where O2 tension is high and CO2 tension is low, the CO2 is exchanged for O2 by reversal of the above two mechanisms which we have seen. So increased O2 levels decrease the CO2 and H plus binding to hemoglobin, and this is known as the Haldane's effect. The CO2 thus released from the carbamino hemoglobin, and that is formed as a reversal of the carbonic anhydrase reaction which diffuses from the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli to enter the expired air. And lungs regulate the pH by controlling the CO2 levels in the blood. And this whole mechanism is achieved by controlling the rate of respiration, which is ultimately determined by a set of receptors known as the chemoreceptors. So I will pass on my mic to Rahil and he'll take over. Thank you.
I am MD Rahil. Now my role is 68. Now I will discuss about the renal regulation of pH. So from the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation, we can see if we change the concentration of base, we can alter the body pH. So we are taking a condition that the pH of the body has been decreased. So now the body compensatory mechanism will act somehow so that the concentration of base is increased. Now here the renal kidney has mainly 4 kind of mechanisms by which the pH will be increased. First one is reabsorption of bicarbonate. Second one, secretion of H plus ion. Third one, combination of H plus with phosphate and ammonia. And fourth one, generation of new bicarbonate. So the first mechanism, reabsorption of bicarbonate. After filtration from glomerular capillary, there are ample amount of bicarbonate in the tubular lumen. So somehow we have to take this bicarbonate from tubular lumen into the peritubular capillary so that the blood pH will increase. So as the bicarbonate is a large anion that cannot usually pass the apical surface of the PCT cell membrane. So it combines with H plus ion that comes through Na plus H plus exchanger and forms H2CO3. In presence of carbonic anhydrase, the H2CO3 breaks into water and carbon dioxide. Then the carbon dioxide, being a gas, easily passes to the cell membrane. And inside the cell, the carbon dioxide reacts with water to form carbonic acid. And this carbonic acid then further break into H plus and HCO3 minus. Now, this HCO3 minus has come from the tubular lumen into inside the cell. There are 2 processes by which the bicarbonate can go to the capillary from inside the cell to the peritubular capillary. The first one is chloride bicarbonate exchanger antiport, and second one is sodium bicarbonate symport. So that's how the bicarbonate has reached from the tubular lumen to the peritubular capillary, and the pH of the blood has been increased to normal level. Second one, secretion of H plus ion. By secreting H plus ion, we can also increase the blood pH. So in the previous slide, we have seen that there is H plus ion forming inside the cell. So the H plus ion by 2 transporter, there are 2 transporters. One is potassium hydrogen ATPase ATPase pump, and second is H plus ATPase pump. By these 2 pumps, the H plus ion can go from inside the cell into the tubular lumen. So the H plus can be secreted by urine. Third one is combination of H plus with phosphate and ammonia. So why it is needed that H plus has to be combined with phosphate and ammonia? Because our kidney has a maximum level that pH of urine can be reached, the maximally is 4.5. Beyond this, the pH cannot be decreased. So the excess amount, our body produce daily almost 80 millimole of H plus, but via urine only 44 44 microosmol of H plus can be secreted. So the excess H plus can be secreted by only combining with phosphate. Now the H plus is combined with HPFO2 minus along with sodium. This form NH2PO4 ion that can be excreted by urine, and also the H plus combines with ammonia and in the form of ammonium chloride salt that is excreted by urine. Now the fourth one, generation of new bicarbonate. So in the PCT cell, there by the action of glutaminase enzyme, glutamine is broken down into HCO3 minus and NH4 plus. The HCO3 minus that is reabsorbed into the peritubular capillary, and the NH4 plus has entered into the tubular lumen. So now that come into the thick ascending limb. Here the NH4 plus enter the cell, and by entering the cell, it comes into the interstitial space. Now the NH3 has to be excreted by urine, so that has to be enter in the peritubular capillary. Here ammonia enter the collecting duct cell and then enter into the tubular lumen. Here the ammonia combines with the previously came H plus, and ammonium ion is formed, and later on it is excreted by urine as ammonium chloride ion. So when the body's compensatory mechanism fails, there is case of either acidosis or alkalosis. If there is increase of pH, that is called alkalosis, and decrease of pH called acidosis. If the increase or decrease of pH is only associated with the change of acid, that means partial pressure of carbon dioxide, it is a respiratory problem, and the metabolic problem is associated with concentration of bicarbonate. So in respiratory acidosis, the pH as it is acidosis, the pH is decreased, and to decrease the pH, we have to increase the concentration of acid. So there is case of hypoventilation, and the bicarbonate is either normal or for compensatory mechanism that can be slightly increased. In respiratory alkalosis, there is increase of pH, but partial pressure of carbon dioxide is decreased. So the pH can be increased. In metabolic acidosis, also decreasement of pH, but the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is normal, but HCO3, the base concentration of base has been decreased, and in metabolic alkalosis, the pH is increased and the increased by the increasement of the concentration of base. So that's all. Thank you so much.
Very good. The time management is good, but the presentation was not so because you were just reading out. That is not expected. Okay, one question. Chloride shift. Why there is chloride shift? Why we require chloride shift to take place?
Sir, chloride shift is done to change the bicarbonate to enter the bicarbonate ion inside the cell. For
What
the
will happen? What will happen if there is no chloride shift?
ionic balance will be hampered, and
Anything else? There is a specific term.
electrolyte imbalance.
Anyone else? Have you ever heard of Donan membrane equilibrium? Donan membrane equilibrium.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So chloride shift occurs to maintain Donan membrane equilibrium. Right?
Yes.
Thank you.
So, a very good afternoon to our respected professors and my fellow batchmates. My name is Mohammad Ubaid Rashid Mullah, and today we are going to present a seminar on the topic diabetes mellitus and diabetic ketoacidosis. Before we begin, I would like to introduce to our members Mehndi Dhara, roll number 71, Mohammad Ubaid Rashid Mullah, myself, roll number 72, Mohammad Rayan Sheikh, roll number 74, Mohammad Minaz, roll number 73, and Muskan Rai, roll number 75. So without any further delay, I would like to begin our presentation. So our presentation is about diabetes mellitus. What exactly is diabetes mellitus? If we go against the definition, it is a chronic metabolic disease which is characterized by persistently high blood glucose level. It occurs when the body either cannot produce enough insulin or cannot effectively use the insulin it produces, in which it leads to long serious health complications. The key features are chronic hyperglycemia, disturbed carbohydrate metabolism, altered fat metabolism, and protein metabolism. India and its relation with diabetes. It is often called the diabetes capital of the world. Why? Because more than 100 million Indians live with diabetes. The next slide is about normal glucose homeostasis. Well, glucose homeostasis is the process in which the blood glucose level is maintained between 70 to 110 mg per dl. The hormones which regulates are insulin, glucagon, and other hyperglycemic hormones. Insulin, which is secreted by the pancreatic beta cells, which lowers our blood glucose level, increases the glucose uptake, and promotes glycogen synthesis. It also stimulates protein and fat synthesis. Glucagon, which are produced by pancreas, but the alpha cells, they increases the blood glucose level, stimulates the glyconeogenesis and gluconeogenesis. Other hyperglycemic hormones are epinephrine, cortisol, growth hormone, and thyroxine. The food we intake, it increases our blood glucose level, in which insulin is secreted by the pancreas. There is an uptake of glucose by the cell, and glucose is stored in the form of glycogen, and the blood glucose level is back to its normal amount. Now, what are the types of diabetes mellitus and how can we classify it? Well, there are 4 types of diabetes mellitus. The first one is the type 1, type 2, gestational diabetes mellitus, and secondary diabetes mellitus. In the type 1, there is an autoimmune destruction of the beta cells which causes an absolute insulin deficiency. The body produces little or no insulin at all. In type 2 diabetes mellitus, insulin resistant with relative insulin deficiency. The body don't effectively respond to the insulin it produces. In gestational diabetes, which occurs during pregnancy, and secondary diabetes, which are due to pancreatic diseases, endocrine disorders, or drugs. Out of these 4, type 2 diabetes approximately accounts for about 90 to 95% of the cases. The next slide, I would like to invite Mehndi Dhara to say about it.
The slide is about the risk factor of diabetes mellitus. In case of type 1 diabetes mellitus, their genetic predisposition, autoimmune destruction, viral infection, and environmental triggers. Next, in case of type 2 diabetes mellitus, there are obesity, sedentary lifestyle, family history, increasing age, hypertension, and metabolic syndrome. Now, we will look at insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is a complex condition in which our body doesn't respond well to insulin when the body is exposed to too much blood glucose over an extended period of time. Its consequences are blood glucose level remains high, more insulin is secreted, compensatory hyperinsulinemia develops, and eventually leading to beta cell failure. Next, we will move to pathophysiology of diabetes mellitus. How hyperglycemia occurs. In case of type 1 diabetes mellitus, insulin deficiency occurs, then reduced glucose uptake leading to hyperglycemia. In case of type 2 diabetes mellitus, insulin resistance takes place, then cellular response is reduced leading to hyperglycemia. As a result, we can see persistent hyperglycemia. There are some additional mechanisms, increased gluconeogenesis, increased glycogenolysis, and increased glycogen synthesis. Here are the clinical features of diabetes mellitus. Now pay attention at 3 P's of diabetes mellitus: polyuria, frequent urination; polyphagia, excessive hunger; polydipsia, excessive thirst. There are some other common symptoms: weight loss, fatigue, blood fission due to fluid shift in eye, delayed wound healing, and recurrent infection. The symptoms of type 1 diabetes mellitus are come quickly and they can be severe. In case of type 2, the symptoms often develop slowly and they are too mild to be noticed. Then the gestational diabetes is oftenly asymptomatic and sometimes the symptoms are maybe mild. Acanthocytous nigricans is a skin condition characterized by hyperpigmentation and thickening of skin due to insulin resistance. Now Ryan will continue.
Good evening everyone. My name is Mohammad Rayan Sheikh, roll number 74. Now we have the diagnosis of the diabetes mellitus. In the diagnosis, we have the following test. The first one is a fasting plasma glucose. If the level of the fasting plasma glucose level is more than or equal to 126 mg per dl, this is an indication of the diabetes mellitus. The second one is a random plasma glucose. If it is equal to or more than 200 mg per dl with the symptoms like the polyphagia, polyuria, polydipsia, this is an indication of the diabetes mellitus. Then the third test is a 2-hour oral glucose tolerance test. If it is equal to or more than 200 mg per dl, it is an indication of the diabetes mellitus. Now the other test is a HbA1c. Now what is HbA1c? HbA1c is basically the glycated hemoglobin, which means that how much the sugar is binding with your RBC. If it is equal to or more than 6.5%, this is an indication of the diabetes mellitus. Now what is the importance of the HbA1c? A hemoglobin A1c test is a blood test that shows your average level of blood glucose, also called blood sugar, over the past 2 or 3 months. Now we have the complications of the diabetes mellitus. In the complications, first one we have the acute complications. In acute complications, we have the diabetic ketoacidosis, which also is a part of our presentation. The second one is the hyperosmolar hyperglycemic state, and second one is the chronic complications which affect the microvasculatures and the macrovasculatures. In microvasculatures, we have the retinopathy, damage caused to the retina of the eye; nephropathy, impairment of the kidney; and third one is a neuropathy, nerve damage that causes the pain, numbness, tingling, or muscle weakness. And effect on the macrovasculature, we have the coronary artery disease, cholesterol and fatty acid deposit in the artery causing the restricted blood flow, and stroke. Blood flow to the brain is interrupted. That is why the brain cells die. And the third is a peripheral vascular disease. It is a slow progressive circulation disorder that narrows or blocks the blood vessels outside the heart and brain, which blocks the peripheral blood vessels. And then we have the management of the diabetes mellitus. See, once you are diagnosed with the diabetes mellitus, you cannot completely cure it, but you can reduce the degree of the complications by managing it, by the lifestyle modifications, by taking the balanced diet, regular exercise, weight reduction, smoking cessations, and by taking the oral hypoglycemic drugs like the metformin, glimepiride, and the sitagliptin, and the insulin therapy used in the type 1 diabetes mellitus and the selected type 2 diabetes mellitus patients. Now, Minaz will continue.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mohammad Minaz, roll number 73, and I will be discussing about a medical emergency known as diabetic ketoacidosis. It is a acute, life-threatening disease, primarily due to type 1 diabetes. As my friend Ubaid said, in the type 1 diabetes, there is lack of insulin. If the insulin is not there, so the glucose will not enter into the cells, leading to a condition called hyperglycemia, in which the blood glucose level increases more than 300 mg per dl. Okay, so if the glucose is not entering into the cell, the body will think there is no glucose, so it will break down the fats and it will lead to condition known as ketoacidosis, because ketone body formation will occur, and it will lead to metabolic acidosis because ketone bodies are acidic in nature. So the blood pH will decrease, and the high number of ketone body will make the, as I discussed, and we will get dehydrated. Why? Because the glucose level in the blood is very high. So the blood will pull the water into itself, because the water will move from low concentration to high concentration of the solute. So along with glucose, water will also come out in the urine. So next slide is precipitating factors or the causes or triggers, how it occurs. Infection, injury, infarction, insulin deficiency and intoxication. In infection, the body needs energy, but as due to lack of insulin, there is no glucose in the cell, so it will trigger diabetic ketoacidosis. In injury or in infarction like trauma, surgery, myocardial infarction or stroke, the body is in stress, cortisol level are high, glucose is high, but insulin is not there. In insulin deficiency, the person is already in lack of insulin, and if he is missing his insulin doses, he will create his situation more worse. In intoxication like alcohol abuse or drug abuse, he will like vomit more, or the condition will get more worse. Next is the pathophysiology, how it occurs. Like in type 1 diabetes, there is lack of insulin. As I discussed, glucose is not entering into the cell, the body will break down the fats. There is no TCA cycle occurring, oxaloacetate is converting into glucose by gluconeogenesis, and the fats will ultimately produce the ketone bodies, which will be accumulated in the body, which will lead to metabolic acidosis and finally diabetic ketoacidosis. Different types are acetoacetate, beta hydroxybutyrate and acetone. I will be discussing about acetone in this slide. Like clinical features, as discussed, severe dehydration, and if the body is dehydrated, it will cause weakness, and if the brain is dehydrated, it will cause confusion and altered consciousness. And if the acetone, it is a volatile liquid which will lead to a fruity odor in the breath of the patient, and respiratory disease like CO2 is increasing because metabolic acidosis is there. So person will be doing Kushmal breathing, which will be discussed by my friend Muskan.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll continue from where my friend left. One of the important clinical features of diabetic ketoacidosis is Kushmal breathing. It is a form of hyperventilation linked to metabolic acidosis, and it is a compensatory mechanism to decrease the increased CO2 in the blood. It is categorized by deep, rapid labored breathing, and the important clinical symptoms are nausea and abdominal pain. The patient usually feels tired because lots of energy is required during rapid breathing. Next, I would like to discuss the diagnostic criteria and management. Few of the important parameters to diagnose diabetic ketoacidosis are if the blood sugar level is more than 250 mg per dl, if the arterial pH is less than 7.3, if serum bicarbonate is less than 18 milliequivalent per liter, and if ketone bodies are found in the urine, the patient is diagnosed with diabetic ketoacidosis. The management of diabetic ketoacidosis is done through the following mechanism. Number one is fluid replacement. It is done through IV normal saline to maintain hemodynamic and to regulate renal perfusion. Second is insulin therapy. It is done to regulate the insulin levels in the blood. Third would be electrolyte correction done through potassium replacement, and fourth is treating underlying causes. For example, antibiotics are given to treat infection. Next, I would like to present a case study on diabetic ketoacidosis. A 16-year-old girl with a known history of type 1 diabetes mellitus presents with vomiting, abdominal pain, and deep rapid breathing for past 10 hours. She had missed her insulin doses for 2 days due to febrile illness. On examination, On examination, it was found that she was dehydrated, drowsy, and has a fruity odor in her breath. Respiratory rate was found to be 28 per minute, and the blood sugar level was 250 mg per dl. Arterial blood gas test shows that pH is 7.10, and serum bicarbonate level is 10 milliequivalent per liter. Urine shows positive Benedict test and positive Rotheras test, which shows that urine has glucose and ketone bodies. On diagnosis, it was found to be diabetic ketoacidosis. I would like Minhas to conclude our presentation.
And in the last, on the occasion of Doctors' Day, I would like to say, let's listen to the doctors. Thank you, everyone.
Overall good presentation. Nicely you have mentioned. They are in the places of anti-diabetic drugs. You can mention the different groups of drugs. Because nowadays, you mentioned three drugs. They fall in 3 different groups. So group-wise naming was better instead of giving the individual names.
7.1, bicarbonate 10.
Sorry.
The patient, what will be the state of patient? I mean, only she will present with deep breathing and abdominal pain. She will be literally in a state of coma, almost in a state of coma. So pH 7.1 is quite low pH, and bicarbonate is going to be almost exhausted. I mean, 10 milligrams, very severe ketoacidosis. Patient will be extremely drowsy. At least I think I must say it is in a comatose state. Number 1. You said about 5 P's, 3 P's. Diabetes is having 5 P's. Another 2 P's are, one is pruritus, generalized pruritus, and 5th one is polyneuropathy. Okay? So there are 5 P's involved, and you need to explain what is the basis of polyuria, polydipsia, and polyphagia. You must understand. If you cannot answer, you can tell me. First slide you said silent. Yeah, diabetes is silent. Why you have said this thing? Silent? You have added one adjective. Silent epidemiology. Why you have said silent? Why it is silent?
স্যার আনডায়াগনোসড এর জন্য জানতে পারি না মানে কখন হবে
Any disease cannot speak.
No, not about that. Like it's a chronic disease. It's a chronic disease which is for a prolonged period of time. So the patient does not know when the disease is starting until he's getting severe symptoms.
Is it the cause?
No, not the cause.
This is the reason why it is called silent. You know why it is called silent? Because most of the patients remain asymptomatic till the disease is quite advanced. The disease remains in almost silent condition. And that is true for almost all chronic diseases, including hypertension and renal failure. When the patient presents with symptoms of renal failure, usually urea level is around 180 and creatinine level near 10, 8, 9, 10. So they are also silent diseases because they don't produce any severe cancer. And again another thing. Until unless it reaches almost 4th stage, 3rd stage, no symptom is produced. Body adapts it.
My name is Swati Sharma, roll number 140, and I 140. And I, along with Swarnika, Swarnadeep, Swastika and Swami, are here to present on the topic protein energy malnutrition. Now, protein energy malnutrition is a broad term, but it can be defined as spectrum of nutritional disorders that is caused by deficiency of proteins, calories or energy or both that leads to impaired body functions and growth failures. It is one of the most widespread nutritional problems in developing countries like India, and its rate varies from 6% to 45% in different areas depending upon their socio-economic status and level of education and awareness. Now we have malnutrition. Malnutrition is basically a condition which is caused due to insufficient or excessive intake or absorption of nutrients. We have two types of malnutrition here, undernutrition and overnutrition. Undernutrition is caused by inadequate intake of nutrition that leads to muscle wasting, stunted growth, and people being underweight, while overnutrition is basically caused by excessive intake of nutrition that causes obesity and more body fat. We have some figures as per ICMR, that is Indian Council of Medical Research here. That is, people suffering from undernutrition is 42%, stunting 48%, wasting 20%, while children suffering from overnutrition is seen generally less, like only 20% of the children being overweight. About 45% of deaths in children under 5 years of age in India are caused by undernutrition. We have chronic malnutrition and acute malnutrition. They are both the types of undernutrition. Chronic malnutrition basically occurs due to inadequate intake or absorption of essential nutrients over a prolonged period of time. It is commonly seen in children under 5 years of age, and it leads to stunting, that is low height for age, impaired growth and development, it's long-term and persistent. While acute malnutrition occurs following a sudden reduce in intake and quality of food, it causes rapid weight loss or low weight for height, that is wasting. Now I would like to call Swarnika to continue from here.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Swarnika, roll number 138, and I'm going to continue from here. Coming to direct and indirect causes of malnutrition, at the center we can see poverty, which is basically the root cause of malnutrition, because due to poverty there is lack of education, lack of food, poor sanitation and poor healthcare conditions. We can see two direct causes of malnutrition. One is insufficient intake of proteins, food, calorie and essential micronutrients, and another is severe diseases like diarrhea and pneumonia, which basically decreases the nutrient absorption in our body, thus making malnutrition worse. We can see some indirect causes of malnutrition like insufficient household food security, insufficient child maternal care, little education of women, unhealthy environment, malfunctioning of society, injustice, war and natural disaster. So basically malnutrition is not only caused by lack of food, but it's a combination of poverty, diseases, lack of education and poor healthcare conditions. Coming to kwashiorkor, which is basically one of the two major forms of protein energy malnutrition. This is basically caused by lack of protein in diet, and it generally affects children of 1 to 5 years of age, which can be due to poverty, ignorance or child abuse. We can see some pictures of clinical features of kwashiorkor, starting with distended abdomen, which may be due to fatty liver. We can see moon face, which can be due to edema, and we can see some dry scaly patches and sparse thin hair. Coming to the detailed clinical features of kwashiorkor, starting with edema, retention of fluid, especially in ankle and feet, because there is low protein in the blood and low serum albumin level in the blood, thereby reducing the oncotic pressure, resulting in accumulation of fluid in the tissues, causing edema. Moon face, as we have seen in the previous slide, fatty liver due to impaired fat metabolism, distended abdomen sometimes due to hepatosplenomegaly as well, poor appetite, dermatitis, dry peeling of skin, scaly red patches, depleted muscle mass and wasting, because protein is necessary for growth and tissue repair, so lack of proteins leads to these clinical features, dry brittle sparse hair, irritability and fatigue, stunted growth. Now I would like to hand over the mic to Swarnadeep.
Thank you, Swarnika. Myself, Swarnadeep Shah, roll number 137, will continue from here. So what is basically marasmus? Marasmus is a severe form of protein energy malnutrition in children below 1 year of age. Causes could be early weaning, repeated infection, poverty and poor scarcity. Now we can see here the 3 images of children diagnosed with marasmus. You can see a similar condition here, that is a prominent skeleton and ribcage can be seen here due to the excessive fat and muscle wasting. So next, the clinical features of marasmus, that is visible wasting of fat, muscle, prominent skeleton, no edema, face may appear old and wizened, dry, loose skin, sunken spontaneitis, weight loss more than 40%, stunt growth, weakness, BMI below 16. And this is the main clinical feature of the marasmus. We can say it as children with the main features of marasmus. Now I would like to ask Swastika for the next topic.
Hello everyone, my name is Swastika Parida, roll number 139, and I'll be presenting from here on. The differences between kwashiorkor and marasmus. The age of onset for kwashiorkor is 1 to 5 years of age, while for marasmus it is less than 1 year of age. The deficiency, there is protein deficiency in case of kwashiorkor and there is overall calorie deficiency in case of marasmus. The cause of kwashiorkor is starchy diet after weaning, and for marasmus it is early weaning. Weaning is the process of introducing semi-solid and solid food to infant diet to eventually stop breastfeeding or formula feeding. Retardation is present in both kwashiorkor and marasmus. The attitude of a kwashiorkor child is lethargic, while of a marasmic child it is irritable. Appearance, the body appears plump due to edema, and in kwashiorkor child it is shrunken. Appetite, in kwashiorkor it is anorexic, and in marasmus it is normal. Skin appears dry and scaly in kwashiorkor, and in marasmus it is dry and atrophic. In serum albumin level in kwashiorkor is less than 2 gram per dl, and in marasmus it is 2 to 3 gram per dl. Serum cortisol level is increased in kwashiorkor, and it is serum cortisol level is decreased in kwashiorkor and is increased in marasmus. Biochemical assessment. Hypoalbuminemia, poor wound healing and edema are hallmarks of kwashiorkor. Albumin level is less than 2 gram per dl in kwashiorkor. However, the value may not be so low in case of marasmus. The standard value for albumin in children is 3.5 to 5.5 gram per dl. So the value is decreased in both kwashiorkor and marasmus. However, in kwashiorkor, it is significantly decreased due to protein deficiency. Fatty liver is seen in kwashiorkor due to decreased lipoprotein synthesis, ApoB 100. In marasmic children, glucose tolerance is often normal, but hypoglycemia is seen. Hypoglycemia is seen due to glycogen stores being used up. However, glucose tolerance is normal because the function of insulin remains relatively intact. Hypokalemia and hypomagnesemia is seen as marasmic children. I would like to hand over the mic to Swami.
Good afternoon all of you, myself Swami, roll number 136. So the next topic is marasmic kwashiorkor. Marasmic kwashiorkor is severe form of the protein energy malnutrition, which continues symptom of both marasmus, extreme calorie deficiency, and kwashiorkor protein deficiency. As you can see in the chart, in case of kwashiorkor, low deficiency, low dietary protein cause low protein and leads to hypoalbuminemia. Hypoalbuminemia cause less oncotic pressure, ultimately cause edema. Low ferritin causes low hypoalbuminemia. Hemoglobin and anemia leads to impaired beta lipoprotein and it's ultimately cause fatty liver. In case of marasmus, there are low dietary calories, causes less glycogen storage, and there is more glucose, and then glucose converts into triglycerides and ultimately convert into fatty acid. And protein catabolism, due to which muscle loss happen, and it all leads to marasmus and kwashiorkor. Treatment. The treatment of the protein energy malnutrition can be divided into 3 stages. Hospital treatment. The following conditions like hypothermia, hypoglycemia and electrolyte imbalance should be corrected. Second, dietary management. Diet providing 150 to 200 kilocalories per kilo body weight and 3 to 4 gram of protein per kilo body weight. The food should be nutrient dense, easily digestible, and consume frequently in small quantities like fruit, vegetable, dairy products, and many more. Rehabilitation, health education and regular follow-up to assess improvement in condition and prevent recurrence. Kwashiorkor depends upon its severity, fluid and electrolyte imbalance may need to corrected. With intravenous fluid and infection may require treatment with antibiotics. Marasmus, a nutritious, well-balanced diet with loss of fresh fruits and vegetable grains and protein will reduce the risk of malnutrition and any related marasmus. So I would like to hand over this mic to Swarnika.
Coming to the conclusion, protein energy malnutrition is preventable, but it's a serious health problem which is mainly affecting children, and it can even cause death if left untreated. So as future healthcare professionals, it's our duty to reduce its burden, and we can do it by some measures like spreading awareness about protein, energy malnutrition, kwashiorkor and marasmus, conduct nutrition education programs in villages, because in villages there is lack of sources, they do not have the proper information about healthcare. So it's very necessary for us to conduct education programs to educate them about protein, energy malnutrition and how this to be prevented. Promote breastfeeding and balanced diet, ensure access to nutritious food for children, because nutritious food is really essential for proper growth of the children. Help needy children with food rather than money, because the roadside children do not have the proper knowledge of what is right and what is wrong. With the money we give, they can buy harmful substances like drugs. So we can give them some healthy meal which will be providing them some education and nutrition. Encourage regular health checkups and growth monitoring to detect early malnutrition before it becomes worse.